Okay, welcome to the flip learning for aggression and the genetic explanation. Just so that we can whiz through things you've already done, in the lesson we went through the XYY super male. This is largely to do with Sandberg's theory, who identified that there were, in the 23rd chromosome pairing, that some males were born with an extra Y, so they were XYY instead of the traditional XY. In 65, Court Brown took this idea and made the recommendation that 314 patients should be hospitalised due to the fact that they had it and they were a danger to society, that they could end up being more aggressive than the general population. He based this solely on common knowledge of traits of males versus females. So the idea that a male is more aggressive than a male is XY, a double Y must mean more aggression. And actually, there had been no real research into it at this point. The media got hold of this finding and coined the term the super male. And in 1966, a mass murderer took that idea of the XYY, somebody who was XYY, and claimed he was a victim of the syndrome. And that the reason why he tortured, raped and murdered these people was because he was XYY and he couldn't help it. Court Brown's assumption was made prior to any examination of those 314 patients. He actually hadn't done any testing yet. And once he did, he retracted his statement and said actually he no longer believed it. 20 years later, Thielgaard compared the XYY, XY and the Klinefelter syndrome XY and found that while there were slightly more aggressive tendencies in an XYY, it wasn't a significant finding. It was no more than we would expect by chance. The only significant difference between an XYY and a normal male is that an XYY is taller. Okay, so other AO1 in this area. Studying genetics. We talked at the start of the lesson about the fact that genetics is a question of nature versus nurture, and in order to disentangle whether something is nature, genetic, or whether or not it's environmental, we've got a couple of different methodological techniques, twin and adoption studies, as well as trying to identify specific genes. The twin studies that you'll do, monozygotic twins share all of their genes, while dizygotic twins share only 50%, the same as a standard sibling. Researchers compare the similarity for a particular trait, and in this instance that's aggression, between the MZ and DZ twins. What we should find is that the MZ, if it's genetic, share more similarity than the DZ. Most twins have focused on criminal behaviour rather than trying to isolate a specific gene. They've looked at criminal behaviour. But a few of the studies specifically aggressive behaviour using adult twin pairs, and they found that they can account for about 50% of the variance. So there is definitely a genetic factor, but they're only accounting for about 50% of the variance seen. Obviously, if it's monozygotic twins, you'd expect 100% if it is solely an aggressive genetic trait. Adoption studies also help us untangle the relative contributions by looking at correlations between a child and their biological parents and their adoptive parents. If a positive correlation is found between the adoptee and their rearing family, then it implies that something has been nurtured. If the correlation is with their biological family, then it tends to be implied that it must be genetic, because the biological family has had no hand in their rearing. A study of over 14,000 adoptions in Denmark found that a significant number of adopted boys with criminal convictions had biological parents, particularly fathers, so showing that something is being passed down the male line, with criminal convictions, with Hutchings and Mednick providing evidence for a genetic effect. Looking further on page 12, there's the role of MAOA. Now, we've looked at MAOA before in media. Although no individual gene for aggression has been identified, they have tried in the XYY supermale, a gene responsible for producing a protein called monoamine oxidase A has been associated with aggressive behaviour. So MAOA regulates the metabolism of serotonin. Serotonin is associated with impulsive and aggressive behaviour. So in the 1980s, a study of a Dutch family found that many of its male members behaved a particularly violent and aggressive manner. A large proportion of these had been involved in serious crimes, and these included things like rape and arson, both very violent attacks. These men were found to have abnormally low levels of the MAOA in their body, and a defective gene was identified. So it seems like a gene might cause low levels of MAOA, which has a problem regulating serotonin as a result. So it's arguably hormonal, but that it is a gene at fault at the end of it. You can see here the way that your AO1 would break down. There is a line of argument for the entire essay, but you would start with twin and adoption studies. You'd put a little bit of AO2 in amongst it, then XYY supermale with the argument they have tried to identify a single gene, the problems with the XYY supermale, and then more recently we've been able to identify this defective gene responsible for MAOA. Okay, so that's your AO1. Remember that I'm not expecting that for the first lesson back. I want that for the last lesson of the week, please. So lesson 3 on genetics, and I will check your AO1. If you do have time to do it for the first lesson, do so and I will mark it in that lesson. But there's no pressure to do that for people who have got a quick turnaround on this flipped learning.